It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Howdy ho, hey. Hee 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 ha. Welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show. It's me, Douglas Coleman. How are ya? Not a lot of time to chit-chat today. David Bedford is here. David is an author, conveniently from Liverpool, England, and his books are about the Beatles. He's got various books, and he's also got a documentary film that was made, which he's in, called Looking for Lennon. I just watched it a couple of weeks ago. It's on Amazon Prime. Very good. Tells the story of John Lennon's early life as a child up to 1962. And interviews with the original Quarrymen. A lot of great stuff. Check out David's website, davidabedford.com. It's a full show interview, so we will be right back with David Bedford.
You're listening to Mr. Smooth and Savvy right here on the Douglas Coleman Show. We'll be right back after these commercial messages.
Hi there, this is Stuart Epps, record producer. This is my story about Elton John, working with him in those early years, going back to 1967 at Dick James, all the amazing tours, those first recordings, going through to Rocket Records. And it's an amazing story about his incredible rise to stardom and my part in that. So look forward to taking you on that journey. So here we go. Yeah, and to order this great audio CD, please just email me at stuartepps@talk21.com. That's Stuart, Stuart, Epps, EPPS, at talk, TALK, 21 in figures.com. Stuart Epps at talk21.com. Email me and I'll give you all the details for buying this brilliant audio disc. Thank you. Bye.
The Douglas Coleman Show is now offering a complete radio promotional package for music artists. Your track will air 28 times a week for 1 month over all of our online and terrestrial platforms, as well as permanently archive on Spreaker, iTunes and many other sites. Your profile will also be featured in our featured music artists page on our website. With this package, you will also get a 15-minute interview on our show to promote your latest single, EP, LP, or upcoming gig. Similar packages like this can run hundreds of dollars and often are subscription-based. Our package is a one-time fee of just $49.99. Please go to douglascolemanmusic.com/CRPP. That's douglascolemanmusic.com/CRPP for complete details. Let's work together to get your music heard.
Are you an independent musician? How would you like to have your songs played on hundreds of radio stations just like the one you're listening to right now? Join MusicSubmit.com and we'll promote your music to radio stations and blogs in your genre. It's free to set up your account, and we guarantee your music will be considered for airplay by radio stations worldwide. Why not sign up today? It's free. MusicSubmit.com. Radio promotion for indie musicians.
Tired of living in a culture of lies, fake news, and alternative facts? The Pro-Truth Pledge reverses the tide of lies by calling on politicians, and everyone else, to commit to truth-oriented behaviors. The pledge asks signees to commit to 12 behaviors that research in behavioral science shows lead to truthfulness, such as clarifying one's opinions and the facts, citing one's sources, and celebrating people who update their beliefs toward the truth. Private citizens who sign the pledge get the benefit of contributing to a more truth-oriented society. Public figures get more substantive rewards for signing the pledge in the form of positive media and public recognition. The pledge crowdsources the truth by asking volunteers to evaluate the statements of public figures who sign the pledge. Take the pledge, demand that your elected representatives do so, and encourage your friends to take it at protruthpledge.org.
DJ DJC Music and DJC Productions are pleased to announce a brand new website. We have started a listing website for radio show hosts as well as potential show guests. This is a meeting site where hosts and guests can come together. Show hosts can list their show and types of guests they're interested in booking. Potential guests can list their talents, bio, accomplishments, or anything they feel makes them an interesting radio show guest. There are no recurrent payments, only a one-time $5 listing fee. Your listing will stay up until you decide to cancel. Previous guests of The Douglas Coleman Show are welcome to submit their guest listing free of charge. Go to radiohostsandguests.com. That's radiohostsandguests.com.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, David Bedford. Hi, David. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you very much. Good to be talking with you.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. I found you in one of those Beatles groups, and I can't remember which one, but I saw photographs and I saw some things, and then I went to your Facebook site and saw all the books that you've written. Now, how many have you written so far?
I've written 2 on my own. I've done Liddypool, Birthplace of the Beatles, which was the first one to come out, followed by the Fab 104, the Evolution of the Beatles. I then co-authored a book with Hunter Davis, official Beatles biographer, and 2 guys, Spencer Lee and Keith Badman. We did one called The Beatles Book, which has just come out in paperback within the last month. And then a friend of mine, Gary Popper, and we've just published the new book, which is Finding the Fourth Beatle.
Hunter Davis I've heard of. In fact, I had one of his books from years ago. Must be 30, 40 years on now. Was he like the first one to really do an official Beatles biography?
He's the only ever official Beatles biographer. He spent 2 years interviewing the Beatles, their family, their friends, between 1966 and 68. He's the only ever official Beatles biographer.
Okay.
So that was good fun doing that with him.
Yeah, I bet. Now, when did that book come out, the one that he did originally? That had to have been in the late 60s, early 70s?
68.
Yeah. So the Beatles were still the Beatles.
Absolutely, they were still together, yeah.
I wonder if he had to do an amendment after that, because a lot happened between 68 and 70 for them, yeah?
Well, what he ended up doing was, I think it was every 10 years approximately, he would do an updated version, but he wouldn't change the content of the book, but he added more to the foreword and to the introduction to say where he'd either found out something new, something different, added something else into the story, and just sort of brought the story up to date. So you could buy updated ones. So he kept the original integrity of the book that he'd done, but did updates once every 10 years.
So what is the Fab 104? I'm curious about that title.
That came out of my first book, Liddypool, and that book was Liddypool's about the Beatles and Liverpool. Nobody had done a book just about the Beatles' history in Liverpool, etc. And one of the chapters in there I called the Fab 27, which was just charting the musicians from the first lineup of the Quarrymen and going through to 1962 when Ringo joined. There was so much interest in that one chapter that I thought, okay, there's more than just these musicians. Let me have a look. I still kept it between the start of the group in 56 and the end of 62. I expanded it then to do almost like a rock family tree. So any other groups the lads have been in, anybody else who appeared as part of the group, whether they acted as a backing band for somebody. And then I sort of went the other way and thought, well, who actually taught them to play? Who taught the Beatles to play? So people like Arthur Pendleton, who virtually nobody's ever heard of, but he was a near neighbour of Julia Lennon, John's mum, and he was a very good harmonica player. So Julia sent John to Arthur Pendleton to learn to play the harmonica. And when you think how important the harmonica was to those early hits, Arthur Pendleton deserves his credit. So they were the kind of people I was seeking out. They had to have played a part in the musical evolution of the Beatles. So either teaching them to play, playing as part of the group, or another group that they had played in. Like George was in a group called the Rebels. There's only 4 of them in it before he joined the Quarrymen. So it's looking at those other musicians as well, just telling the musical evolution, and almost picking up on one of the famous quotes that John Lennon had said was, we were 4 guys. I met Paul, said, "Do you want to join my band?" Then George joined, and then Ringo joined. We were just a band. And they were more than just 4 people. There were 104 people. So that's where the Fab 104 comes in. 104 people in the evolution of the Beatles right up to 1962.
I can't believe there was that many.
Yep.
And you write about every single one of them in the book, yeah?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
I do it all chronologically. A lot of it is original research. There's people who've never been interviewed before. Interesting people like Norman Chapman, whose name occasionally pops up. He was a drummer in somewhere around July 1960. So before Pete Best joined the Beatles to go to Hamburg, Norman was the drummer, very good drummer. And just before the Beatles were going to Hamburg, he got called up to do his national service in the army. And so he missed out on being a part of the Beatles. And there was virtually nothing known about him. And I managed to find his daughter, who very kindly trusted me, and only me, with her dad's story, but the only ever published photographs of her dad, Norman, as a drummer. So there's stories like that which nobody else has ever been able to get. And that was the fun of it, including a guy called Jeff Lee, who, and everybody would say, who? Jeff Lee, he was a school friend of John. And he's the one that actually said to John, "I know you love your music. Why don't you start a skiffle group?" So by Jeff telling John, "Why don't you start a group?" John started a group called the Quarrymen. The Quarrymen became the Beatles. And again, nobody'd ever interviewed Jeff before. So that it's important people like that who deserve their bit of credit in the story of the Beatles.
I agree. I just can't believe there's 104 of them.
Oh, yeah.
That is amazing. Yeah, well, I guess, every step of the way, one piece of the puzzle had to fall into place.
Yeah.
For the story to go as it did. One of the ones that I've always been fascinated with, and I don't know if you've written a book on him or not, was Stuart Sutcliffe.
Yeah. Stuart, I'm actually, I helped to run the official Stuart Sutcliffe Fan Club on behalf of the Sutcliffe family.
Oh,
so
great.
yeah, a big passion of mine. So yeah, I've written about Stuart in each of my books.
Well, let's talk about him for a moment, if you will.
Sure.
He was, I think most people know who he was. And although the Beatles, when they left Hamburg, I believe Stuart already had quit the band, yeah?
Well, they went to Hamburg a number of times. So the first time they were there was between August and December 1960. Stuart was still part of the band, but he stayed behind with Astrid, his girlfriend, who became his fiancée. When the Beatles returned in the spring of 61, Stuart was part of the band still. But by the time it got about May, June 61, he was thinking of concentrating more on his art. I think Paul, out of all of the Beatles, was not happy with Stuart's professionalism. And at one point, Paul decided the only way to settle this on stage was to have a fight. And because Stuart was only small and quite slender, Paul thought that would be an easy fight. And it wasn't. So that they were punching and rolling around stuff for about an hour and gave up in the end. But Stuart, he's been denigrated by a lot of people to say he couldn't play the bass. He stood with his back to the audience. He was never plugged in. And I'm a very, very fierce supporter of Stuart. At the very beginning, he was learning to play the bass. But I've spoken to and read interviews with a number of people, musicians, who say Stuart was a very good rock and roll bass player. He loved the music. He looked absolutely great on stage. And he really enjoyed what he was doing, but his art was more important to him. And so he decided that he would quit and concentrate on his art.
His art is tremendous. I've seen some of his work, and he was absolutely a brilliant artist.
Outstanding.
There were also things that I've read, and now people say sometimes, okay, the relationship between Stuart and John was a bit more than just friends, but I don't really want to get into, who slept with who or anything. I don't really care.
No.
But there did seem to be, or I read that there was a certain amount of jealousy between Paul with his, let me rephrase that. Paul was jealous of Stuart's relationship with John. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah. John looked up to Stuart. He was that little bit older, a lot more mature, was a brilliant artist. And they became almost like brothers, very, very close friendship. And because before Stuart joined the group, John and Paul were the closest. A lot of commentators have said that Paul was a little bit jealous. I think Paul's admitted it as well. He was a little bit jealous that Stuart was close to John, when that's where Paul thought was his rightful position. So that certainly came into it. I think also the fact that Stuart managed to get a fiancée like Astrid, who was drop dead gorgeous, and they all fancied her. I think there's a bit of jealousy of that as well.
One of the things I always found interesting about the relationship between Lennon and McCartney was it always seemed like John, at least publicly, he tended to treat Paul like the little brother.
There's a knock-on effect with that, because Paul always treated George like a little brother.
Okay.
And Paul has said that. He said his problem was, Stuart was like 18 months younger than him, said. And of course he always was, and I always treated him like that, and I regret that. And of course the age gap was bigger for John, because, John was born October 1940. George wasn't born until February 43. So when George started hanging around the Quarrymen, John didn't want him in the group because he was so young, but he was a good guitarist, so he said that was okay for him to come in. The John and Paul relationship is absolutely fascinating, because when you think about it, John's that little bit older. I wouldn't necessarily say more mature. I think Paul probably had a more mature head on his shoulders. But they've both gone through the loss of their mothers in their teenage years.
Right. Yeah.
That brought them close together. It's not something they had to talk about, but they understood each other through that. And I think probably what maybe some people do is look at what happened at the breakup of the Beatles and after that, when they were fighting, and forget that at the start they were really, really close friends, very good friends. And thankfully they did, make that up again in the 70s before John died. Because they were, and I remember interviewing May Pang years ago, and she was with John in New York, and George had turned up, and it's the first time George and John had spoken for a while. And May just said George had to shout it out at John. He had to get it out of his system. And May said she knew at that point, you don't get involved between the four of them. He said the four of them are so closely knit together. You stay out, because it's like family, and family don't always get on with each other. But normally, hopefully, they resolve it. And I think because they've gone through such a public breakup, and then all the lyrics in the songs backwards and forwards and stuff, I think sometimes it gets forgotten what good friends they were at the very start. Their partnership was great. I think, because John would admit he was lazy. And the good thing was, by the time they were famous and it'd be time for a new album, they'd be getting together. And, John has said, Paul would come and say, I've got about 8 songs that we could consider. And John would think, oh, crap, I better go and write some songs. And that would spur John into going. And he could go away, come back within a short amount of time with some absolutely brilliant songs. And that's the competition between the two of them. That's what made them so great. Because they could spark off each other, they could inspire each other, and they could work together. And that's why, even though they both achieved tremendous success in their solo years, they couldn't really touch what they could do together, because they were both geniuses.
But very opposite in their, I don't want to say in their taste of music, because that would be inaccurate. But they were very opposite in what they wrote. But when they brought it together into the band, they kind of were able to format it in such a way. Like Paul would come in with something very classical, perhaps.
Yeah.
And John could bring in something very weird, like I Am the Walrus.
Yeah.
But when they put it all together into the band, it sort of worked. It worked where other bands that did that had to completely rewrite stuff, and then people would get very precious about it and say, no, don't change that, don't. But the Beatles always managed to come out with a great song, no matter who really wrote it. It always fit in the sort of Beatles format. I suppose the exception to that was early on with Yesterday, where, and you've probably seen it, where they were on Ed Sullivan, and Paul did his solo, essentially. And John sort of gives him a little elbow about, oh, that sounded just like him, in sort of a sarcastic way.
Yeah.
And you knew that it was kind of this isn't a Beatles song, or at least that's what I'm getting from John with that remark, Yeah,
no, I agree with you. And I think that's where we have to give the credit to George Martin at the very beginning, because the stars at the time were always a person and the whoever's. And George Martin said, he was talking with his producer Ron Richards, saying, should it be John Lennon and the Beatles, Paul McCartney and the Beatles? In the end, he said, no, it can't be either of them. They're unique. And I think that's what the Beatles brought to the music scene. Was, first of all, they were singing their own songs, which didn't happen before that. But you end up, by the end of the Beatles' career, you've got 3 singers, but 3 top songwriters.
Yeah.
Because by Abbey Road, George is on a par with Lennon and McCartney with his songs. So they all brought something different. And as you say, we've been looking, last year at the anniversary of the White Album, which is just full of so much in the way of different styles and variety of all kinds of stuff. And it doesn't always necessarily work on one album, even though it was a double album. But I think that's what made them all work, because John was always a rock and roller. That was his love. Rock and roll, bit of country, he was happy. Paul's musical tastes were wider. Musical variety, jazz, as well as rock and roll, R&B and all these other things. So I think they needed that blend for each album to work. So there was something for everybody without it sounding like it was jarring. And where you had other bands, maybe like the Rolling Stones, for example, they were very clearly, we are an R&B band. We do rhythm and blues. So if anyone's bringing a song to the group, it's got to be rhythm and blues. The Beatles weren't constrained by that because of all the massive influences, from each of the Beatles. Very important.
Yeah, I agree. When you listen to a Stones album, there is a definite format to their songs. With the Beatles, perhaps in the early years, but by the time they got to Rubber Soul, they just blew the door wide open. And
anything goes.
Anything goes, yeah, and everything goes. And everything did. Absolutely. I did want to ask you, since you're from Liverpool, are Liverpudlians very protective of the Beatles in the sense that the attitude is, oh, well, they're ours. You know, they came from here, they're ours. We own them.
The only time it ever comes up, because normally we can go anywhere in the world and somebody hears the accent and said, are you from Liverpool? Yeah. Oh, the Beatles. So they associate that. Apart from the occasional either politician or someone wanting the attention down in London who likes to try and claim that, well, they had to come to London to make it, so London made the Beatles. Now, there's a north-south divide. There's an interest, I wouldn't say hatred, but a massive distrust between the north and the south, between Liverpool and London. And if they dare to try and claim it's London that made the Beatles, we will go absolutely ballistic, and we have done in the past. So we will defend our right. They're ours.
Well, yes, you plant your flag firmly on the Beatles. Yes. Yeah. Let's talk just a little bit about Liverpool, because I've never been there, but I've always wanted to go. It is I assume it's still very working class.
So this is where we have to separate myth from reality.
Okay.
Brian Epstein, absolute genius of a man, and he put this marketing plan together of these 4 tough working class lads from this industrial working class town. And I do this because I'm a tour guide as well as being an author. And almost on every tour, when people come here, they go, oh, I didn't expect it to look like this. We've got some of the finest architecture in the country. We've got more public parks and green open space per square mile than any city outside of London. John Lennon grew up in a very middle-class, typical English village. And so it's not what you would expect it to be. And sometimes I always apologise that when we do full colour, we're not in black and white. Because that's what a lot of people think. Black and white, dirty buildings, and they've seen ships and stuff. Yeah, no, we've got trees and all sorts. We're very modern here.
Well, I think you're right. I think most of the pictures I've seen of Liverpool were all black and white, and it was just soot-covered buildings and factories, and
That's why I ended up writing Liddypool as my first book, because I ended up reading Beatles books, and they would write the same stories about Liverpool and getting them wrong. And so I filled the book with photographs. There's over 800 photos in there. And it shows off quite a lot of our beautiful architecture, our parks, the landscape, everything. It's a beautiful, beautiful town. And we've got over 800 years of history. So the Beatles were recent history. There's a lot more went on before them. And that's one of the great things about the Beatles being from Liverpool is that, tourism here, the estimate is worth around £90 million per year, Beatles tourism. It employs over 2,000 jobs.
Wow.
Just for the Beatles tourists. And the great thing is, when the fans come here and they come and explore and see the places where the lads grew up, they are all, almost to a person, are stunned that Liverpool is such a beautiful city. And quite often they will then come back and spend more time here. So you've got to come over. You've got to come and see it.
Oh, I think I will. Yes. I know somebody else there who's a musician who I've interviewed on the show. And so now I know 2 people.
Yeah, I'll show you around with pleasure.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Is the cavern still there?
A cavern is still there.
Okay.
But not the cavern. The original was demolished in 1973. The cavern, it closed and reopened a few times, but the people from local rail network wanted to do an underground system between our local stations, and where that was going to go was right by Matthew Street, and so they said, we need that road, and so they got a compulsory purchase order, and the cavern and the buildings around it were demolished. And then the rail company said, oh, do you know what? Actually, no, we don't need to do that anymore. And so it was torn down for nothing. It was then just covered over as a car park for many years, and was sort of forgotten about. They moved the cabin across the other side of Matthew Street to a cabin pub, so they kept that sort of tradition going. But the original cabin club was filled in. Nothing really happened in Liverpool regarding Beatles tourism, really, until John was murdered. And then with John, having died at such a tragically young age, the fans wanted to come to Liverpool and see where he was born, where he grew up, where he went to school. And there was no original tourist attractions. There was nothing to see. There was no guides, nothing. And thankfully, some people put that right. So they recreated the cabin on the original site, using a lot of the original bricks as well. So when you go down there now, it's about 50 or 60% of the original site, and you get a feel for what the original was like. The only thing they can't recreate is the lack of fresh air, the overflowing toilets, and the smell of rotting vegetables. So you're probably quite grateful that you can't get that anymore.
There were no windows at all in that place. Yeah?
There was one doorway in and out. There was about 18 or 19 steps. You went down underground, no fresh air. Of course, a lot of people would be smoking as well.
Yeah.
And say with the smell of the toilets and everything else, the music must have been brilliant, because nobody in the right mind would walk into that atmosphere. And no alcohol as well, of course.
It sounds like it would have been a death trap if there would ever have been a fire.
Absolutely. No such thing as health and safety back then.
Yeah.
It's all changed now.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I did want to ask you about your book, Looking for Lennon, and it was also made into a documentary film.
Yeah, the book isn't finished yet, and I'm still working on that one.
Oh, okay.
But the documentary, that came out last year. It got shortlisted for a National Film Award here in the UK, which we're very, very honoured by. It's still on UK television here at the moment, so we can't get it on DVD, but it's available on DVD and Blu-ray in the States, and has been for 2 or 3 months at least, I think. So you can get it over there.
Okay, I haven't seen it. I'll look for it, because I would definitely be interested. How is it different? I mean, what's different about it than every other Beatles anthology, or what's new in this particular book or film?
Well, what we did, myself and the director, Roger Appleton, we sat down and we watched every Lennon documentary that's ever been made. And we watched most of the Beatles ones that have been made. What we wanted to do was, we wanted to tell John Lennon's story, not the Beatles. Okay, so we wanted to go through his childhood, his school, his musical roots, and everything up to him becoming a famous Beatle. We weren't going to cover the famous Beatles years at all. So we wanted to do his early life, because there are just so many tragedies, and that the story is so intricate and complicated. The fact that he didn't really have a relationship with his father. He was taken away from his mother at the age of 5 to live with his auntie and uncle. His father figure, his Uncle George, died very, very suddenly when John was only 14. His mother was knocked down and killed when John was 17. His best friend, almost brother, Stu Sutcliffe, was killed by brain hemorrhage at the age of 21. So what we wanted to do was to tell John's story, not the story of the Beatles. But unlike the other ones that are out there, which it seemed to be, and the same sort of happened with 8 Days a Week, where you bring in some famous faces, some celebrities who have a tenuous link to the Beatles. And we watched a couple that are done here in the UK, and there was one which is supposedly a tribute to John. None of the people in the show actually knew John Lennon. 2 of them weren't even born when he was killed, but they were minor celebrities in this country. So we said the only people going in our documentary are going to be either historians to put the context, or people who knew John personally. And that meant, obviously, it's a lot of people I've got to know over the years, and finding others who knew John. So we had a lot of help from John's cousins and his sister, even though they didn't want to appear in the film. They were very helpful in shaping that. We got a number of photographs, family photos, which have never been seen before. And then it's the interviews with school friends, right from the time when John started school at the age of 5. So there's a guy, Michael Hill. He knew John from the age of 5 through Dovedale School and all the way through Quarry Bank, and played a major part in John getting turned on to rock and roll. Then someone like Nigel Wally. Now, Nigel was in that first little gang of John's when he first moved into his Aunt Mimi's house. So at the age of 5, Nigel was one of the 4 friends, the others being Pete Shotton and Ivan Vaughan. Nigel's the only one left of the 4, and he was a very, very close friend of John's, and he's the only eyewitness to John's mum being knocked down and killed. So he could tell us those personal stories. The people from school could tell us some lovely stories about knowing him. We got the guys from the Quarrymen telling about how the group got started. People from the art college where John was, who either rarely or never been interviewed before. And then other musicians who were around with him. Then we got Jürgen Vollmer from Hamburg, who knew John really well. So these are all people who knew John personally, and that was the criteria to get in there. That we had to tell John's story, warts and all, and it had to be told by people who knew John. And no other documentary that we've ever discovered has ever done that.
You said you interviewed Jürgen?
Yes.
Did you ever get to interview Astrid or Klaus Forman?
No, sadly. I would have loved to have done. I know Astrid's not been in the best of health for the last few years. I've met Klaus briefly, just a quick hello, a couple of minutes, but never interviewed him, which would be nice.
Also, I was wondering, have you had any run-ins with Yoko?
And the complete opposite. The very first Beatles story I wrote, which started me on this path to becoming an author, was back in the summer of 2000. I've got 3 daughters. They were all born at the same hospital John Lennon was born in, Oxford Street Maternity Hospital. And when my wife and I moved here, we lived quite close to Penny Lane. And so the nearest school was Dovedale School, which is where both John and George went. So summer of 2000, and we had our daughters at the school, we were trying to raise money for the playground. So we set up a charity, which I was a part. And we put out public pleas for funds. But we also put out a private one to Yoko. And she responded, said, "How much money do you need?" And we said, "Well, we need about £27,000. And she said, "I'd like to give you £30,000 to do all the work that you want to." Said, because John loved his time at Dovedale. And from that, she's been over to the school a number of times.
Wow.
Made other donations. When she did that, I thought, wow, that's not the Yoko that people know.
No.
And I thought, I want to tell that story because she's been so generous. So I wrote that story for the London Beatles Fan Club magazine. I thought, oh, that was fun. I enjoyed doing that. And I just said, "Do you want some more stories from Liverpool?" And they said yes. So that became the British Beatles Fan Club, which I helped to found. And I still write for the magazine. So that's how I got started. So Yoko's been here a number of times. I met her about 10 years or so ago. She was coming to do a relaunch event at Mendips, the house where John had grown up. And when she was doing anything official, she always invited some of the children from Dovedale School to attend. By then, I was the chair of the Board of Governors, which I still am, helping to run the school. So we took a number of children to Mendips, and we met Yoko there. And she was absolutely wonderful with the children. She really was. So Yoko's done a lot for Liverpool in John's memory. a lot of positive things, including the naming of the airport, which is now the Liverpool John Lennon Airport.
Yeah, isn't that great?
Yeah. So, yes, she gets a lot of bad press for some stuff, but for the interactions I've had, and for what she's done for Liverpool, she's done a heck of a lot. So I'm grateful to her for that.
I don't know if she's gotten a raw deal. I think she did when everybody blamed her for the Beatles breaking up. It wasn't her fault. I don't believe that.
Was easy. It's an easy target, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't blame her.
No.
The only thing about her that I would say might have been, it certainly didn't help, was the stories I've heard like during the White Album where she had a bed brought into Abbey Road.
Yeah, that sort of broke the code, I think.
It's like she sort of overstepped her boundaries a bit. And in some of the photographs where I heard Linda wanted her out and she refused to move. Things like that. But on the good side, I've heard that she's very protective of John's image and using his image. She's very protective of his legacy.
Yes.
And, good. I'm glad she is.
Absolutely. Yeah, she's done a lot of good in his name.
So you never had any issues with her as far as writing a book or something or using John's namesake and image?
No.
You never got phone calls from her lawyers or anything, no?
No, never a problem. I like when we were doing the film, we let her know this is what we were doing. So even though the period of history we were covering didn't include her, because we were effectively stopping in 1962, as a courtesy, we still wrote to her just to let her know and sent her an invite for the premiere. Didn't expect her to come. But we just thought, it'd be polite to do so. We did that, and she never sought to do anything to harm it, because what we've done is genuinely to show the real John Lennon, and we've had nothing but amazing praise from everybody who's seen the film, which is very gratifying, really is.
We've already run over our 25 minutes. But I'm having so much fun talking to you because I'm a big Beatles fan and many of my listeners are Beatles fans. So I think they'll appreciate if we just go on. So if you're free, we can just do the hour. We got about 10 minutes we can go on for. I did want to ask you about Finding the Fourth Beatle, which is another book that you, I guess, co-wrote, yeah?
Yeah.
There's been a lot of people that have been considered to be the fourth Beatle, or the fifth. Actually, no, the fifth Beatle.
That's the fifth.
Yeah. So, okay, tell me the fourth Beatle. Well, I'm confused now with the title.
Good. He's got you thinking. The big debate: who is the fifth Beatle? We could talk that one for years.
Yeah.
But no, the fourth Beatle. So this book came out of the Fab 104. So within that, I was saying about the 104, the people, the musicians, etc. And in that book, I'd discovered that in that period, they had 12 different drummers. And my friend Gary Popper, he was the producer for Looking for Lennon, the documentary. And so he said, once we got into working on the Lennon documentary, he said, do you know what, the thing about your Fab 104 book, nobody else has pointed out that they had 12 drummers. He said, wouldn't it be fun to do a book about the drummers? Do you fancy doing it? I said, I'm up for that. That sounds good to me. And so we thought, so we call it 12 Drummers Drumming, which we thought would be a great title, until I found the 13th drummer, which put paid to that one, and then the 14th and the 15th. And my job was to go and find as many drummers as possible. Gary's job was to stop me going and finding more drummers. So we just I kept finding more and more drummers. And again, the criteria, they had to have played as part of the group or have recorded with them. They must have appeared with them between the Quarrymen and the Beatles going up to the end of 1970. They must have been part of that process. Just kept finding more and more drummers. And what we realised was when you look at Beatles history, the biggest sort of crises all the way through tended to revolve around who the drummer was. So when the Quarrymen drummer Colin Hanson quit, they were without a drummer for 12 months. So they weren't a group. Then in 1960, they went through so many. They had a guy called Tommy Moore, who was a really good drummer, but he had a big argument with John. But again, I was able to track down members of his family. So we got the most complete biography of Tommy Moore that's ever been published. We then got Norman Chapman, I mentioned before, and then a couple of guys who played only once. Now, if you know of Jackie Lomax, who recorded Sound Milkshake, he was part of a group called The Undertakers in Liverpool. Great band. But on one night only, and for one song only, Jackie Lomax got up and played a song with the Beatles. And he said, I was so terrible, I just took myself off the stage. So, then there's this legendary guy called Ronnie the Ted, and I've been trying to find him for 15 years or more. That same night, there was no drummer, and he was a teddy boy, and he was a big fella, and Lennon wouldn't say no to him. So he got up and he played the drums terribly for the whole night. So we found him. They were sort of, there was always a drummer problem. So going to Hamburg, it was all looking fine until Norman Chapman got called up to join the army. Quick, we've only got a week. We get Pete Best, he joins. A bit of stability for 2 years. And then they got the next crisis when George Martin saying, well, if I'm going to give you the contract, and they were only at an audition stage, then I'm going to use a session drummer. Well, John, Paul and George thought that meant George Martin didn't rate Pete, which wasn't actually the case, but they misinterpreted that. Another crisis, they need another drummer. And many people think that John, Paul and George wanted Ringo to join the band, so they sacked Pete. And that wasn't the case. First of all, what I was able to prove, the biggest mystery since 1962, which was, why was Pete Best sacked? I can now prove Pete Best was never sacked. It's complicated in explanation, but I interviewed Brian Epstein's lawyer, and he confirmed Pete was never sacked. Basically, that they had to trick Pete into thinking he was being sacked, and so they basically got him to quit.
Oh, wait a minute. Now I'm confused. All right, so George Martin didn't want to use Pete for the recording, is that correct?
That's right, which is standard practice back then.
Why? I mean, was he that bad of a drummer?
No, it was. It's quite simple. So I've done a whole chapter on session musicians. I mean, you'll know the Wrecking Crew, Hal Blaine, etc.
Yeah.
We have the equivalent over here. In a studio, the technique of drumming on a record is an acquired skill, which not many people have, particularly if you are only used to playing as part of a live rock and roll band. So because it can be quite an expensive process to hire a studio for hours upon hours, hiring a session drummer is a cheap and efficient way of making a record. Now, for example, the first drummer who was asked to join the Beatles after they decided to get rid of Pete was a guy called Bobby Graham, top session drummer. He played on, you reckon, 15,000 songs. About 50 of them were #1 hits in the UK with bands like The Kinks, You Really Got Me, Dave Clark 5.
Yeah.
These were all session musicians playing on these records. So actually, all George Martin was saying was, don't mind what you do as a group. You know, as McCartney said, Pete's great in the halls and the venues they're playing. All George Martin was going to do was bring in a session drummer. And so Bobby Graham was asked, and he turned them down. A guy called Richie Galvin was asked. He turned them down. Ringo was then offered the job. And then this is the one that will confuse the life out of you, and I don't have the answers to. The best drummer in Liverpool was a guy called Johnny Hutch. And Johnny was a good friend of mine. He sadly died about 4 weeks ago. And he was asked to join the Beatles the day after Ringo was asked. Now, that just leaves so many questions that we can't answer. We don't know what that meant or why, but it definitely happened then. So 4 drummers were asked. Ringo was the guy who said yes.
So Ringo must have been known to George Martin, That
No.
he was... No?
No, George Martin never heard of him.
Okay, well then why would they assume he would be competent as a session drummer for the studio?
Oh, I like good questions like this, because these are exactly the questions that I was asking. So what did they do? Did they contact George Martin for his advice? To which the answer is no, which I think possibly they should have done. And maybe that's why they asked Bobby Graham at the start, because he was one of the most renowned session drummers in the country. What we know is that when the Beatles go down at the beginning of September with Ringo, George Martin didn't know they changed the drummer. So he's a bit surprised to see him. But they weren't ready to record yet anyway. So they ran through the songs, and they went through about 15 or 16 takes of Love Me Do with Ringo. And at the end of it, George Martin said, no, that's no good. I'm still going to bring in the session drummer. So when they went back the following week to make the record, a session drummer called Andy White was brought in, and he drummed on Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You. So the use for a session drummer, and Andy White was perfect for it. He turned up, he talks to the musicians, he learns the song, they go down, 2-3 takes, done, sorted. And then he was off. That was the beauty of having a session drummer. You knew exactly what you were getting. And when you're making your first record, it's going to be a gamble. So you're going to do it as cheaply and as quickly as possible. So that's why George Martin used a session drummer.
Okay, well, that makes sense. And it also makes sense. Yeah. I know something about recording because I'm a musician myself, but especially in those days, they recorded live.
Yes.
And I could see where a live drummer would just be way overpowering for the recording. So they needed somebody who knew how to do it very lightly and, you know, okay, I get that. Yeah. Okay, so then Ringo, who actually wanted Ringo in the Beatles then?
George was the one who spoke up for him. They first got to know Ringo out in Hamburg in 1960, about October 60. He was out with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and so they became friendly, and they got to know them pretty well over the next couple of years. George got particularly close to Ringo as friends. John and Paul, were friendly with him, but there's no sort of friendship as such. So George was the one who's saying, I think Ringo would be great. Now, whenever I'm doing these kind of interviews and talks, I always say that, all right, George wanted Ringo in. Ringo was not the only drummer to be asked, but thank God he was the one who said yes. Because the whole point and purpose really of the book is that Ringo's the fourth Beatle. John, Paul and George are the Fab Three. And all this time they were going through all these different drummers, different musicians, whoever. They were trying to find the one who would last, the one who would work perfectly with them. And Ringo was that guy. And even though after the first session, George Martin used a session drummer, after that he didn't need to. Because Ringo was more versatile as a drummer. He had more experience. He'd played so many different styles of music as well that he could adapt. And so what I then wanted to know was, if he took Ringo out of the group, and some people have said this, one, he was just a lucky guy. Secondly, well, if you take John, Paul or George out, you haven't got the Beatles, but you could take Ringo out and it wouldn't make a massive difference. I would say absolutely not.
No, I disagree.
Yeah, because one of the big things we wanted to prove with this was, why was Ringo the one that lasted? You cannot get through just on being a lucky guy. And so, because I'm not a drummer, I'm a musician. So I play guitar, I can play bass, I can play keyboards, I can't play drums. I interviewed, I think, about 9 different drummers. And I'm saying, just tell me why Ringo is so good at what he does. What's his technique? And you get the simple things like he's naturally left-handed playing on a right-handed kit. Just by doing that, that gives you a different sound.
Right, yeah.
He never liked a big full kit full of loads and loads of tom-toms and everything. He loved to keep it simple. And so with talking to all these different drummers, we analysed why Ringo was perfect for what he did. And there's this wonderful phrase, which I was trying to get to understand, which was, Ringo knows how to play the song. And what he did, he has something which you cannot teach. That if the other lads would be bringing a song in, he would start just playing along, thinking, right, I think I know what I'm going to do on this one. And he could do 5 takes of it, and each one would be different, depending on what he was feeling. And that is a hell of a skill to have. And so it meant that he wasn't there to do loads of fills. He hated doing that. He said, just because there's a space doesn't mean it needs to be filled. And you then, and I recommend this to everybody, is go back and listen to the Beatles songs and listen to the drumming. And you listen to the evolution of Ringo's drumming. And you suddenly realise that you take Ringo's drumming out of some of these songs, it's not the same song.
Oh, God, no, yeah.
Yeah, he became part of the song creation. And that's why he's the 4th Beatle. He's the one that lasted the pace with them, because he had that connection with them.
The song that comes to mind when you said that was Strawberry Fields. And you listen to the drums on that, and it's just incredible.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
And if you took them out, it would completely change the song.
It would, yeah.
Yeah.
And I selected, I think, about 10 tracks. And I got drummers just to pick out what Ringo was doing. And you realise that it wasn't just the drumming, but it's the percussion that he was bringing alongside the drums as well. And then you think, Ticket to Ride, Come Together.
Yeah, yeah. Ticket to Ride was the other one I was going to mention. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Just go and listen to the Beatles songs for the drumming, and you won't listen to the songs the same way. Say, Strawberry Fields Forever is one that always springs to my mind. I play air drums to that every time. I'm not even a very good air drummer, but it's fantastic. And so that's what we wanted to do. So we give full credit to Pete Best, because too many people are trying to say, oh, he was a rubbish drummer, that's why they got rid of him. Not true. For what they were doing at the time, Pete was a great drummer. And the way I summed it up in the book, the chapter I called is The Beatles Are Dead, Long Live the Fab Four. That's the transition. I see them as 2 different groups. That the Beatles from 60 to 62 were a fantastic covers band doing rock and roll, R&B. What they needed to become was a pop group. And that's a different sound, different skill set. That's what Ringo could bring. And that's why he works out perfectly as the 4th Beatle.
Well, on that note, we've got to wrap it up. David, thank you so much for coming on. This was a lot of fun talking to you. I love talking to people who know more about the Beatles than I do. And I'm so glad to find someone, because I could talk about the Beatles forever and ever.
So could I, because they're so amazing. And that's why what I do, it's a labor of love, it's a passion. I love what I do.
Okay, quickly, your website is davidabedford.com, yeah?
That's it, yeah, davidabedford.com.
Okay,
and you
super.
find everything from there.
Well, thanks again for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
My absolute pleasure.
Well, that's about all the time we've got for the show today. I want to thank my special guest, David Bedford. Thank you very much, David. Enjoyed talking to you. Always love talking about the Beatles. This is Douglas Coleman saying I'll see you when I see you.
To the